Incredible Car Cemetery. Belgium is famous for its fine chocolate and beer, but until 10 years ago, it was home to one of the most notorious and intriguing scrapyards in the world. Like a long-forgotten traffic jam, the lines of old cars stretching out into the forest of the Châtillon Car Cemetery was an astonishing sight to behold. Many of these were rusted American motors, which spurred a rumor that they'd been left behind by American forces after the Second World War ended. But most of these cars had been made 20 years or so after the war was over. So, what was the real story behind their abandonment? It was eventually revealed that the cars actually belonged to Canadian Air Force troops. Hundreds of them had been stationed in the nearby town of Virton on behalf of the NATO alliance back in the late 1940s. But because the town was so small, the businesses of repairing the troops' many cars fell on one lone mechanic in nearby Châtillon. However, when France withdrew from NATO in 1966, the troops left, leaving the mechanic with hundreds of cars in a relatively tiny town. Unable to sell them on, they lay rusting and rotting over the years, until they were all sadly cleared away in 2010. Wow, I think I just heard the hearts of all the classic car enthusiasts break. The Ghost Plain of Iceland. The volcanic basalt black sands of Iceland make up some of the most breathtaking beaches on the planet. But while these sands are astonishing by themselves, they're also home to one of the most out-of-place abandoned vehicles in the world. This is the Solheimsandr plane wreck, a twin-engine fuselage of an old cargo plane hollowed out and stripped bare by decades of punishing Arctic winds. Though it looks like a post-apocalyptic grave, it's actually all that remains of the terrifying events from November 21, 1973. On that day, the five-man crew of the C-117 plane were making their way to a U.S. naval station in Iceland when temperatures suddenly plunged to a frosty 14 degrees Fahrenheit. 60-mile-per-hour Arctic gusts pummeled them, and ice terrifyingly froze up both the plane's engines. The plane dropped out of the sky and crash-landed on the beach. But miraculously, every man on board survived without so much as a scratch. The U.S. military eventually rescued them and began stripping the grounded plane of everything it had. They clipped its wings, removed its engines, and took anything that was salvageable, leaving the 5-ton shell littered on the beach. That's pretty rude, although it has left Iceland with a free tourist attraction. Abandoned turbo train. The 20th century space race fueled a competition between the United States and Soviet Russia to see who could create the bigger and better rocket ship. But this also led to the creation of another super-fast jet-propelled vehicle, the turbojet train. It was created back in the 1960s by American engineer Don Wetzel, who'd been tasked with creating a faster and cheaper locomotive. Wetzel had the wacky idea of adding jet engines onto trains to propel them along the tracks, and the resulting M497 boasted two 5,000 horsepower jet engines. These were placed on the front of the train just to make it look cooler, and when it was tested, it was able to reach an astonishing 183 miles per hour. This incredible locomotive development inspired the Soviets to build their own jet trains, and by the 1970s, this amazing machine was born. The head of an old ER-22 engine had been redesigned and modernized, with two turbojet engines from a Yakovlev Yak-40 plonked on the top. But when pushed to its limit, the train only reached about 155 miles per hour. Oh, it still sounds awesome, right? Well, outshined by its American counterpart, as well as being loud and costly to operate, the prototype was abandoned. It was moved to an unused track behind a railcar factory near Doroshika, where it lay forgotten for more than 40 years. Even though it looks like it'd fall apart with a light touch now, I bet a ride on this train in its heyday would have been off the state. They still look as majestic as Missing Milmi 6. So this next Soviet-era vehicle may not be as strange as the jet trains, the river rockets, or the enormous Ekranoplan, but the way it's been abandoned is truly bizarre. Out in the marshes of Russia's Yamalo-Nenets district, almost 1,500 miles from the capital of Moscow, there's something steely lurking in the swamps. Though it looks like a beast, It's actually a wreckage of an old Milne 6 helicopter. When they were first produced back in the 1950s, these 108-foot-long behemoths weighed a staggering 30 tons and were easily the largest helicopters the world had ever seen. But in 1981, the crew of this Mi-6 were flying at an altitude of just under 500 feet, when all of a sudden, both the chopper's engines gave out. The 5-man crew crashed into the swamp below, but by some miracle, none of them were injured. The Mi-6, on the other hand, suffered some serious damage. An investigation later found that the refueling workers had accidentally filled the chopper's tank up with a gasoline-water mix, causing its engines to fail. But no plans were ever made to retrieve the vehicle. Instead, it sat abandoned in the swamp for more than 40 years, during which time its engines and even its tail section have been stolen. That's enough to send any aircraft enthusiast into a tailspin. The amazing MAZ. Do you think the list of derelict Soviet vehicles stopped there? Well, just feast your eyes on this abandoned MAZ 7904. With all those wheels in that split cabin, it looks like some sort of giant mechanized caterpillar. These old Soviet MAZ trucks and tractors were designed during the height of the Cold War to carry all manner of increasingly massive nuclear missiles. So much so that the MAZ 7904 was a 6-axle, 12-wheeled beast designed to carry loads of up to an eye-watering 220 tons. But the chassis alone weighed around 140 tons, meaning its huge 9-foot diameter wheels had to support a staggering 30 tons each. The weighty design was such a critical issue for this vehicle's development that no less than 100 specialists were brought in to ensure it would work. Despite its weight issue, it was rolled out in 1983, measuring over 100 feet long and 22 feet wide. The specialists had fitted it with a turbocharged 42.2-liter engine, so it could produce a hefty 1,500 horsepower. But dragging all that weight meant it had a maximum speed of just 16 miles per hour. On top of that, the prototype handled incredibly poorly, which is the last thing you want to hear about a vehicle carrying world-ending nukes. Despite all the effort that went into making it, it never carried a nuke, and the prototype was left to rust in a hangar in Kazakhstan. By 2007, its tires were unrecognizably deflated, parts of it had been stolen or salvaged, and all it was good for was a handful of photo shoots. Its remnants were eventually scrapped in 2010, much to the disappointment of all the other cool kids who wanted photographs posing next to it, I'm sure. The McBarge. Even though it doesn't boast a set of big golden arches, you probably guessed from the name that the McBarge once belonged to the McDonald's Corporation. It was built back in 1986 for Vancouver's World Fair, which was held on the shores of Falls Creek. So McDonald's took this opportunity to show off a new floating design for their future restaurants. They constructed a brand new, one-of-a-kind restaurant on a 187-foot-long barge for a whopping $12 million. That's around $26 million today. They cornily named it the Friendship 500, a pun that's so bad it makes my jokes look good. The 8,500 square foot restaurant was designed to float to waterfront locations, bringing Big Macs to shores all over the world. It was pretty popular at the first 6-month World Expo, where it was jokingly named the McBarge. But just 5 years later, residents were over the novelty, and the shorefront owners ordered the McBarge to go. It was floated over to the less populated Burrard Inlet in 1991. But instead of bringing in business, it was just left to rot. For more than 30 years, the McBarge has slowly decayed on the coast, gathering dust as well as graffiti. The inside still boasts that classic 80s decor, although most of the interior has been ravaged by decay and vandalism. The windows are covered in grime and spray paint, the floors and walls are filthy, and at one point there were even boxes of old products left on board. It may have been popular in the 80s, but it's the last place you'd want to eat now. The Herkimer Battle Jitney. Scrapyards are filled to the brim with all kinds of abandoned vehicles, but some, like this brilliantly bizarre example, really stand out from the rest. Discovered in a surplus yard out in America, The triple-axled, six-wheel vehicle is unlike any other van, truck, or car I've ever seen. It's truly one of a kind. So what's it doing in a scrap heap? Well, it turns out this isn't someone's abandoned passion project. It's actually got a little bit of fame behind it. Now, many of you will be too young to remember The Mystery Men, a classic 90s film about a group of inept superheroes tasked with saving a city from destruction. In it, the good guys hilariously acquire a beast of a vehicle named the Herkimer Battle Jitney. It looked so well put together in the film that it had many movie fans wondering if it was a real vehicle, some even claiming it was a heavy troop vehicle called the Z-17 Marauder, which had been contracted by the US government. In reality though, the Jitney was just a custom-built vehicle made specifically for the film. Its running gear was a 1979 Ford semi-truck with the cab removed, and the body was a modified Airstream camper. But its heavily customized appearance meant it couldn't be reused in any other film, and so, sadly, it was left to gather dust. Maybe it'll get an ending fit for a superhero in the future. Ditched Lambo. With great horsepower comes great responsibility. Something that the owner of this Lamborghini Huracan forgot, along with his car, back in 2019. Cameraman Andrew Lawrence was traveling through North London, England, early one morning when he suddenly spotted this $250,000 purple supercar lying in a roadside gully. The Lambo was facing the wrong way and was in a ditch on the wrong side of the road, with its driver's side door jammed against the ground. But when Andrew looked around, the owner was nowhere in sight. How tempted do you think he was to call in a tow truck and claim it was his? Being a better man than most, Andrew called the police and tried to locate the car's owner. It turned out that it belonged to Bitstock's founder and Bitcoin millionaire Michael Hudson. He'd been driving down the road when the car hit a puddle of water and aquaplaned off into the ditch. But instead of calling in a tow truck, he abandoned the Lambo and walked off to get help. Fortunately, the damage to the $250,000 car was pretty minimal, and he was able to get it back on the road soon enough. With all that money, I wonder if he'll think about investing in some driving lessons. Holy abandonment, Batman! If you ask me, the best Batman films are the ones where Michael Keaton took on the role of the Caped Crusader. Everything about them was timeless. The costume, the gadgets, Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman, oh my god. The car, although that last one hasn't aged too well, as you can see. Back in 2019, the armored shell of a Keaton-era Batmobile was discovered rusting in a scrapyard. It'd clearly been there for some time, but amazingly, it wasn't the only one to have been abandoned. In 2020, another Batmobile body was discovered in a scrapyard over in New York. Now, obviously, there's only one Batman, so where did these two bodies come from? It appears that big Batman fans built these replica bodies from personal DIY kits, but as their obsession with the Dark Knight faded, so did the love of their custom kits, which they decided to scrap, although they might live to regret that choice. In 2019, this perfect working replica of the Keaton-mobile was put on eBay, listed as having 400 horsepower under the hood and being totally road legal. This thing had a price tag of a wallet-busting $680,000. After seeing that price tag, leaving the parts of one of these in the forest suddenly seems like a real Joker move. The abandoned Blue Wonder. The gorgeous green meadows of Schipkau, Germany are home to an abandoned attraction that really stands out. Stretching almost 170 feet into the sky, with a 40-foot diameter chainsaw-looking wheel at one end, this rusty colossus looks like a weapon built to fight King Kong. When urban explorers discovered the vehicle back in 2002, they believed it was a Bagger 258, a massive bucket wheel excavator used as part of a continuous mining system. As the wheel at the front of the machine turned, those huge buckets attached to it would scoop up earth before dropping it into a conveyor belt to be processed. It was a bit like a factory, although this factory was mounted onto tank-like tracks that could move at a top speed of around 20 feet per minute. However, as more and more explorers came to marvel at this massive, abandoned machine, they realized it actually wasn't a Bagger 258, but a Bagger 1473. It had been built back in 1965 and was once affectionately called the Blue Wonder, thanks to its beautiful blue paint job. Its buckets could each shovel up to a staggering 52 cubic feet of earth, so in less than 150 full rotations, this thing could scoop up enough soil to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool, although not anymore. It was abandoned in 2002 because it had run out of things to dig and was way too big and costly to transport elsewhere.